evening, everybody, and thank you, Mala, for such a nice introduction. It was almost as long as the lecture that I intended to deliver. Film that I would be using as a metaphor is the one I think some of you would have seen also, the film Eat, Pray and Love. How many of you have seen it? Good, good. So, the title itself suggests, and the film in a way kind of seeks to illustrate that irrespective of the socioeconomic context, the socioeconomic background, or the cultural context, the basic activities that humans have can be covered by these three terms: eat, the basic survival; pray, culture, values, norms; and love, societal well-being, social systems. So in a way, it tells us what's the kind of dominant imperatives that drive human civilization. Now, if we kind of stay with the metaphor for a couple of minutes more, what are behind these dominant primary aims? We kind of set aside the screen a bit, and then we see that there is a whole range of economic activities that are behind social systems, that are connected to social systems, that are connected to our cultural contexts, and connected to the rest of the world, which is environment, nature. So very importantly, we have a human-nature relationship driving the way these primary goals are perceived and are addressed in different cultural contexts. It of course varies. Different cultures should perceive differently what we eat. And over time it takes a dynamic sense, because the progress of societies, the material progress of societies, the advance of technology, even population change, they define what we eat, how much we eat, how culture or values, norms, they change over time, social processes, systems, how they adapt. So all this is a very dynamic phenomenon, a very complex phenomenon, but at the heart of it lies the human-nature relationship. And if you have seen the film, you'll find a lot of scenes that are shot on the banks of the river Ganga, which is kind of a metaphorical allusion to this human-nature relationship. So today's the topic. So we are basically in the introductory topic looking at some key concepts, starting with the concept of economic growth, economic development, then mostly focusing on the concept of sustainable development. Then we touch upon the concept of human development, look at the kind of metrics that are being used to monitor and progress development in its sustainable sense, in its sustainability sense, and seek some insights from this interaction. Now, when we look at the concepts associated with sustainable development, we see basically a kind of complex landscape, multiple concepts that kind of come at us, that we seek to understand. So sustainable development, sustainability, human development, it's a very pluralistic landscape. And some of these concepts are loaded with connotations that are defined by the specific scientific domain from which we are looking at these concepts, or the specific culture from which we are looking at understanding these concepts. So when we are talking about a concept like development, then it is very much defined by the scientific domain from which we are viewing this particular concept. So an anthropologist will look at this particular development concept in a different way as compared to an economist. So the particular scientific discipline defines how we understand these concepts. Same with culture also. So these are loaded with connotations that are very much defined by the discipline from which, the scientific discipline from which we come from, and the cultural context. So basically in this presentation, we'll be looking at the human-nature relationships, and I will present before you 5 basic paradigms that an economist called Michael Colby, he defined just on the eve of the Earth Summit. The Earth Summit was in 1992, and this was a paper published in Ecological Economics Journal in 1991. And these 5 basic paradigms, to some extent, are relevant even today. So we start with those 5 paradigms which try to capture the way human-nature relationship has been understood over the ages and how they have been manipulated, they have been looked at, maneuvered to meet some of our development goals, development imperatives. We come to the concept of sustainable development and try to locate it in one of these basic paradigms. And we'll see how the concept originated, what has led to its interpretations. And given the kind of multiple interpretations that such a concept has, because as I said, it very much depends on the disciplinary domain, the scientific domain from which we are coming, the cultural construct. What kind of a process, institutional process, has evolved to bring about a consensus globally on this concept so that we can start thinking of action. So from concept, from theory to practice, how it has happened worldwide. We look at the specific events that started with a conference in Stockholm way back in 1972 to as recent as the Rio +20 conference that we had last month. So over this period, there has been a process which has led to the international consensus on sustainable development. We then bring in the concept of an associated concept, that is human development, and look at some of the dominant metrics, dominant measures that are associated with human development, which are guiding in a very powerful sense public policy making. So measures such as Human Development Index, Human Poverty Index, Gender Empowerment Index, these are measures that are now being monitored globally at the country level to see how much progress individual countries have made and what kind of a collective effort is required worldwide to advance societal progress. And we'll conclude with some check of the state of the planet, where are we now and what's the way forward. So Colby's paradigms, the 5 basic paradigms: frontier economics, a word that was created by the economist Kenneth Boulding in the late 60s, 1966 to be precise. Deep ecology, a paradigm that almost emerged as a reaction to the paradigm of frontier economics. Environmental protection, that was again how the established paradigm of frontier economics responded back when countered by deep ecology. Then we have resource management paradigm, which is the origin of the sustainable development concept, and eco-development, which is a paradigm which seeks to build on what was started in a resource management paradigm. So frontier economics. This is classical economics in operation. And this was the dominant development paradigm till the late 1960s. This defined how countries viewed at societal progress, how they viewed the human-nature relationship. And this is a paradigm, this is a construct of that relationship in a very strongly anthropocentric manner. People are at the center, people's needs are paramount, and the ultimate goal of all activities, of all public policy, is to ensure materialistic progress as with unbridled exploitation of infinite natural resources. So in this paradigm, there are no limits to nature. Nature is bountiful, and it is there to serve society. So all of our strategies are aimed at getting the most out of nature, exploiting nature to its fullest potential. And that is where Francis Bacon, you must have heard that name, he postulated his famous technological program, which was behind the whole industrial revolution. And it is very aggressive view of technology change and to what use technology can be put to. And the view was that we can use technology in all its respects, in all its forms, to get the most out of nature, which is infinite. So very strong anthropocentric view, and the kind of policy implication this paradigm has, that the role of state is kept to the minimum. It's a free market orientation to public policy that is advocated, with private ownership as the relevant property regime. So private individuals are owners of natural resources, and they have the right to exploit such resources to their utmost potential. And when such resources are exploited to almost a scarcity point, then we have Ricardian rents emerging out of it. Those who are from economics background will understand that economic value is created when resources turn scarce, and it is ensured then that such scarce resources are exploited efficiently. But it happens when resources come to that scarcity point. But till then, you are free to exploit in an unconstrained manner. Now, when environmental values are so predominant in society, it almost seems a unbelievable paradigm. But this was the dominant paradigm as late as the 1970, 1966, 1970. In fact, the paradigm actually got weakened when a book was published, The Silent Spring, 1962. Some of you may have seen the film Erin Brockovich, that is inspired by that book by Russell Carson's on the environmental impacts of pesticide use. How big American companies were using unregulated waste disposal methods, and how it was resulting in severe health impacts on citizens. So the Silent Spring was powerful enough to challenge this paradigm. And then you had economists and sociologists, development practitioners, policymakers trying to look for alternative ways to meet societal aspiration, to meet development goals. When frontier economics was being applied in the development domain, there was a reaction. And this reactive paradigm, it's called the deep ecology paradigm. It's almost the polar opposite of frontier economics. So while frontier economics looked at nature as infinite, deep ecology looks at nature as supremely constrained by environmental processes, by carrying capacity, by thresholds, tipping points. So you cannot play gamble with nature. That's the deep ecology philosophy. So very biocentric view of the human-nature relationship, inspired by Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. Some of you must have heard about Gaia hypothesis. Gaia, which is a term for Mother Earth as an organic entity, self-regulating, self-organizing. So the deep ecology paradigm puts nature at the center, and any planning that is to be done, any public policy that is to be framed, it has to be oriented towards giving primacy to nature. So biospaces equality, bioregional autonomy. So it's almost the opposite of frontier economics. So while frontier economics wanted population growth to happen, deep ecology wanted specific measures for population reduction. While frontier economics looked at further advances in technology, continuous advances in technology, deep ecology looks at technology in its lowest interfering form. And often, deep ecology has been characterized as anti-growth, and the main goal of this paradigm is to achieve harmony with nature. Very interestingly, those of you who would have read the Rio Plus 20 outcome document, the recent conference that happened to mark 20 years of the Earth Summit, there is an outcome document, and you can download it from the website. If you go through the document, this phrase appears there, that nations commit to achieving harmony with nature. But this is an imperative that is very closely associated with deep ecology paradigm. So when deep ecology and frontier economics was kind of parallel paradigms till the late 1960s, with frontier economics in the dominant position, it couldn't ignore the environmental impacts when books like The Silent Spring appeared, and there were concerns about the degradation of environment, health impacts, resource degradation, depletion. So they tried to address the concerns of deep ecology by this paradigm. So this is again a response to deep ecologists, environmental protection. So it's almost neoclassical in nature. So while classical approach, the frontier economics approach totally ignored nature and looked at it as a infinite source and sink for ecosystem services, environmental protection paradigm tried to bring in elements of environmental management, but more in the mode of damage control. So it is almost like that we continue to use nature, but we should also have mechanisms to control for the impacts that are realized, the impacts on environment, and to manage trade-offs. So for the first time, when this paradigm appeared to take roots in the 1970s, and to some extent to the 1980s, the issue of trade-offs became predominant. And for the first time, environment and development are put as either or. So you either have environment or you have development. So the environment versus development, that conflict-oriented view, that emerged in from this paradigm. And the whole issue of optimal pollution, even now in many mainstream economics courses, you start by looking at, particularly in resource economics and environmental economics, you start by defining what is optimal pollution. So in a sense, this is trying to proceed with the view that pollution is something that is inevitable. So the best that you can do is optimize it. See, how you can, minimize the impacts in cost-effective ways. This is still strongly anthropocentric as far as human relationship, nature relationship goes. But very interestingly, this led to a lot of innovations in public policy. So the environmental impact assessment that we do today, that came out of this paradigm as a mechanism to control for environmental damages. And often EIA is said to be one of the policy innovations as far as this century goes. So command and control strategies, end of pipe solutions, all these are in the form of dealing with environmental damage rather than trying to control, avoid that damage. Then comes resource management. So it was realized that you cannot simply treat environmental management as a plus. So in the environmental protection paradigm, it's like business as usual plus environmental management. So it was realized that you cannot proceed with that kind of a philosophy. So the resource management paradigm emerged based on the theme of economizing the ecology. And instead of trade-off, which was dominant in the earlier paradigm, it talks about interdependence. It talks about interdependence, complementarities between environment and development. So you no longer have environment versus development. Now the policy orientation has to be environment and development. And that was the background, or this was the paradigm which led to the establishment of the Brundtland Commission. We'll come to that later. Till this time, the dominant form of income accounting was the system of national accounts. So the whole, the system was designed to come up with estimates of gross domestic product, gross national income. So this was largely measures that came out of the system of national accounts, and to a large extent we are following that system. But this paradigm suggested that you should start accounting for natural capital as well. So the United Nations came up with a system of environmental and economic accounting as a progressive alternative to the system of national accounts. So it not only looks at material flows, it not only looks at the goods and services, the material goods and services created in the economy in a defined period, but it also looks at the kind of depletion and degradation that occurs in natural resource system. So it gave the concept of satellite accounts, physical accounts, how much of land is being degraded because of economic activities in the accounting year, how much of water is being extracted out of our aquifers, how much of forest resources are being depleted. So this is the kind of accounting that seeks to complement the system of national income accounts. So instead of GDP, the gross domestic product, we start talking about green GDP as an alternative measure. Of course, in some systems, in some cultures, this kind of a measure is not acceptable. For example, Bhutan has come up with a measure of gross national happiness. This is a very radical view of looking at how we measure societal progress. But the shift from SNA to SEEA is a progressive shift which seeks to account for the depletion and degradation in natural resources. And very famously, this paradigm also introduces the polluter pays principle. Because in none of the other paradigms, you have the responsibility of resource degradation fixed on the polluter. Here, the polluter has to pay. And then eco-development. This is almost further progression of the resource of the earlier paradigm, which talked about economizing ecology. But this is about ecologizing economy. So in the earlier paradigm, the economic system was still at the center, but you are trying to bring in ecological constraints. So you are ecologizing the economy. Sorry, you are economizing the ecology. But in this case, you start thinking about your economic systems as biophysical systems. So this changes the way we are looking at economic activities or the economic system. And it also brings in the concept of ecological uncertainty, which none of the earlier paradigms looked at. The other paradigms largely looked at constraints.